So Congress created the SBIR program many years ago to solve this problem. It's worth a little over $4 billion a year, and essentially it acts like a tax on federal agencies. So each agency has to set aside a certain percentage of its budget to spend on the program based on the size of the program of the agency. So last year, it's 3.2% for SBIRs and 0.45% for STTRs. There's a higher agency size threshold for STTRs. So there's 11 agencies doing SBIRs, but only 6 doing STTRs. There's some basic general eligibility criteria. You have to have a U.S. business. You have to be 51% owned by U.S. individuals and or other small businesses. A U.S. individual is defined as a citizen and or a green card holder. Some agencies like NIH and RPE allow you to also be 51% owned by multiple, but not a single U.S. VC firm. The eligibility criteria aren't terribly well thought out. There's a lot of donut holes in the middle. So a company that is owned, 49% owned by U.S. persons and 49% owned by U.S. VC firms, maybe 2% owned by a university, is suddenly ineligible. And so there's a lot of quirky donut holes in the middle of the eligibility criteria. The business has to be located in the U.S. Every project has a PI, a principal investigator. They have to be primarily employed by the small business throughout the project, which is defined as 51% of their employment comes from the company. NIH is one exception. For an STTR, they allow the PI to come from the university. The federal government uses a curious interpretation of small business. So it's 500 or fewer employees, though the vast majority of companies going after SBIRs are much smaller than that. And then finally, all work must be done in the US. There are ways to get a waiver for that, but it's incredibly difficult to do. Okay, so 2 separate programs, SBIR, STTR. Essentially, they're exactly the same. The big difference is how the money can be spent. And so with an SBIR, the small business has to do 2/3 of the work internally. And then the remaining third can be subcontracted out in phase 1. And then in phase 2, they have to do half the work, and then they can subcontract out half the work. The STTR mandates a university partnership. And so it says that in both phases, the company has to do 40% of the work, the university has to do 30% of the work, and the remaining 30 can go to one, the other, or third parties. Now, STTR stands for Small Business Technology Transfer. And despite that being in the name, there's no requirement that any tech transfer takes place under an STTR. And actually, over half the STTRs that we do, there is no tech transfer taking place. It's simply a matter of a university having a useful set of skills that make the project better, and therefore there's a partnership formed around that. So for instance, maybe a company is developing a cancer drug, and they're looking for someone who can run a certain kind of animal model. They sort of subcontract to the university to get that done. Okay, I should actually raise one more point. Virtually all the agencies interpret these rules very literally about how the money has to be spent. The one exception to that is NIH. NIH does not like these rules because they're extremely problematic in the life science space, because small companies can't really do 2/3 of the work in a phase 1 because a lot of the work they have to do might be like running an animal experiment, and small companies can't sustain their own animal facilities, etc. And so NIH has a curious interpretation, which is that if a CRO does it and it's a routine service, and you analyze the data yourself, you can count it as your own work. And so that's kind of the loophole at NIH. Okay. SBIR and STTR is basically a 3-phase program. Basically phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, crawl, walk, run. So phase 1 is a feasibility study, and everything that I'll tell you about sizes and times has that approximately to it, because each agency is setting their own limits. And so, but generally you're talking about a $250,000 project in phase 1, and usually it's a 6 to 12-month project for a phase 1 project. Generally, phase 2 is a 2-year project, usually $1 million or more, and that's sort of like doing full R&D. And then phase 3 is just theoretically beyond SBIR funding, which means it's privately funded or non-SBIR federally funded or some other funding source. Okay. So generally, the most important thing is to understand how to use the program effectively. So if somebody tells me they think they're doing something interesting, they're using SBIR funding to do it, and they think they can solely fund their company based on SBIR funding, I'm generally willing to bet my house against them. The reality is that you cannot do anything interesting and transformative in the world solely with SBIR funding. There's not enough funding, there's limitation on how the money is spent, and it's too slow. And so there's no scenario where you can solely do this with SBIR funding. Instead, really what this is doing is allowing you to remove risk so that you can, attract investors, early partners, early customers, and future employees. And so it's just a one step in a funding strategy for a company and really targeted at the riskiest aspects of your company's technology. Okay, so as I said earlier, there's 11 different agencies. There's 5 large agencies: DoD, NSF, NASA, Department of Energy, and then Health and Human Services, which includes NIH, CDC, and FDA, but NIH is the vast majority of that funding. Then there's 6 small agencies: the USDA, Homeland Security, EPA, Department of Transportation, Department of Education, and Department of Commerce, which includes both NIST and NOAA. The large 5 have both STTR and SBIR programs. USDA also just recently, 2 years ago, added an STTR program. The smaller 5 only have SBIR programs. And so generally, the thing to understand is every agency is different. And so when you understand the program works, Congress sets some basic rules, which the SBA interprets, but beyond that, each agency is free to create its own program however they see fit. And so if you talk to someone who's like, oh, I want an NSF phase 1, and you're working on an NIH phase 1, understand that everything they're telling you really doesn't apply because it's a totally different program. So each agency is funding different kinds of R&D, different dollar amounts, different proposal formats, proposal review processes, different receipt dates, success rates, how they issue the money, the rules around that, the kinds of reporting you have to do. Everything is different. And so it's really 11 different independent, unique programs just under an umbrella of a program set by the government. Okay. So first thing to understand is where the money is. So those large 5 agencies account for well over 95% of all the funding. And so generally, you do want to figure out how to make one of the 5 large agencies of interest to what you're doing. It's not to say that you can never get funding and you should never do projects with the smaller agencies. It's just they don't have a lot of money. Often their award sizes are much smaller than the larger agencies. So for instance, like if you're doing a EPA project, it's $100,000 in phase 1 and 400 and possibly 500 in a phase 2. Whereas if I go to NSF, I can get $250,000 in phase 1 plus $1 million in phase 2 plus potentially another $500,000 in follow money. So the award sizes are much larger. There's more money to get, and also maybe more credibility that comes from them. And so generally, most people are going to gravitate towards the larger agencies unless there's special circumstances. Now that being said, just because there's more money, it doesn't always mean it's a good idea. And this is a non-SBIR example, but it's just so compelling, I always use it in my presentation. So many years ago, 2011, 12, 2010, there was a big stimulus bill, lots of money floating around. One of the things that came out of that was NIH got $200 million through challenge grants. And NIH promoted the heck out of it. They had $200 million to fund 200 projects. It was open to companies, universities, large companies, small companies, everybody. And they really were just promoting it very, very heavily. At the same time, the Department of Defense got a similar bucket of money, $100 million, except they didn't tell anybody. They published on the website they're required to, and that was the end of it. And the end result was NIH got 24,000 applications for 200 awards, and the DoD got 800 applications. And so there's no reality where you're going after, one of 24,000 trying to win 200 awards that makes any sense for a company. You're talking about sub 1% probabilities. The amount of work that goes into these things is far too large to go after low probability opportunities. And so you have to consider both the money available, but also the competitive space. And I'll talk a lot more about that in terms of SBIRs in a moment. Okay. So generally, agencies have to have topics in order to actually request technologies. And there is different schools of thought across the agencies. So some agencies have very narrow topics. And the classic example would be the Department of Defense. So historically, they've had very, very narrow topics. Let's say they want to fund a battery. They'll tell you, we want the battery that weighs X pounds. It has to have the following energy density, cycle life, capacitance, et cetera. They'll give you very detailed specs. On the other end of the spectrum, the classic example would be the National Science Foundation. The National Science Foundation is completely technology agnostic for the most part. So they have about 35 topics. but they're all very broad. So things like energy technology is a topic, and within the topic, they have subtopics. It might be energy generation, energy storage, energy transmission, but the last subtopic is always other, whatever the topic is, so other energy technologies. And more importantly, at the root level, there's a topic called other technologies. And so what NSF is saying is that they are technology agnostic. They don't want to limit what they can fund based upon the technology area. The one exception to that is that they will not fund anything involving a clinical trial. And so that is a no-go. But beyond that, they are wide open technology-wise. And then various agencies fall somewhere in the spectrum between there. This is, I mean, I wouldn't focus too much on this slide. I think the big issue is that the government fiscal year starts in October. There's generally a series of deadlines. The bulk of the deadlines fall between October and, let's say, April. And then it also turns out that the bulk of the awards tend to get issued in the summer. So the idea being fiscal year starts, lots of opportunities to submit proposal over the next 6 months, and most of the awards come out near the end of the fiscal year, which ends in September. Okay. So these are not random drawings. There's a ton of work that has to be done to actually put together a successful proposal. And I think the one thing people don't often do is actually take the time to pick the right battles to win. And so, you know, they often try to squeeze themselves into topics just because they want the money versus they're actually a good fit. And picking the right topic/agency that matches up with where you are and where you are going is probably more important than a lot of things that actually go into the actual proposal itself. So it's important to understand why you have these 11 agencies. Agencies themselves are not monolithic. And so, like, if I go to the Department of Defense is actually carved up into multiple agencies: the Army, Missile Defense, Air Force, DARPA, Navy, etc. If I go to the Navy has a bunch of different commands: Office of Naval Research, NAVSEA, SBIR, etc. And actually, differentiation in their programs is occurring at each layer. So the Army does things different than the Navy. Within the Navy, you know, ONR might fund their projects at a higher rate or different amounts than, say, SBIR and NAVSEA and different structures. And so, again, it causes more differentiation at every level. And so, again, it's not one program, not 11 programs, but many more than that. Most people think agency topic selection is sort of a obvious thing, but it's actually quite complicated to actually understand where you're best suited. And in many cases, people may be suited to multiple agencies, and understanding where they fit best makes a big difference in whether or not they're successful or not. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 4 of the larger agencies quickly, and then go into detail about NIH, because there's a lot of interesting public data which can help illustrate how choosing where you go makes a difference. So DoD, you know, it's the largest SBIR budget, but it's often driven by very, very narrow needs. And so matching up with a good technology topic fit is really important. Now, while the problem is that you may not find a topic that matches you, the good news is if you do, it's important to understand the reason the topic is so specific is because the DoD actually wants to buy what they're asking for. And so if you actually go through the process, phase 1, phase 2, then you actually potentially are creating a customer. And one unique benefit of an SBIR is if you win a phase 2 SBIR award, the federal government can then give you what's called the phase 3 SBIR award, which really just means they're buying something for you, but they can use the phase 2 bid to count as the competitive bid for whatever they're doing. So let's say you make a widget under a phase 2, they want to buy it. They can just say, okay, we're buying that. And they don't have to put it out for bid. They can just say the phase 2 SBIR was the actual bid, and they can just direct source right to you, sole source, without any competition. Now, one downside working with the DoD is there's a lot of companies that do nothing other than win SBIRs. So there are over 200 companies that have won over 100 SBIRs. There are 6 companies that have won over 1,000 SBIRs. There's 1 company that's won over 2,000 SBIRs, which that company has gotten a little over $500 million in SBIR funding. It should all probably be illegal, but it's not. And so it's important to understand that a few agencies, DoD in particular, but also NASA and Department of Energy, make heavy use of the same companies over and over and over and over again. Those companies aren't really doing much with the technology. Their entire business models are based on winning SBIRs, which is why it should be illegal, but it's not. Now, the one exception historically, and it's starting to even grow beyond this to the narrow topic, is an organization called AFWERX, which is part of the Air Force. They have wide open topics, but very, very small phase 1s. So they used to be 50K, now they're 75K. And the entire purpose of the phase one is to go around the Air Force and find a stakeholder who's interested in your technology. They then sign a memorandum of understanding, which supports your phase two application. If you don't get a memorandum of understanding, you have exactly a 0% chance of winning a phase two. And so, the big mistake people make, it turns out the phase ones from the AFWERX are pretty easy to win. But it's important that you're actually ready to take advantage of the opportunity. So what I mean by that is, let's say that you put in an AFWERX phase one and you win, you go around to the stakeholders, but you're not very far along. And they're all like, this is interesting, show me your prototype. And you're like, well, we don't have one yet. So no memorandum goes to you, you don't win a phase two. It's hard to go back to AFWERX a year or two later and say, oh no, can we get one of these again? Because we have a prototype now we're ready. It's hard to go back and get that second award. So it's important that companies are actually ready to take advantage of the opportunity. Otherwise, they're really going after AFWERX too early. And because the money is all dedicated to customer discovery within the Air Force, it doesn't have a lot of value to the company unless they're ready to take advantage of it. For most companies, NSF is going to be their first stop, and they're probably their most interesting opportunity for a number of reasons. They are by far the most startup friendly. They also run, in my opinion, by far the best SBIR program. They're truly technology agnostic, and so you don't have to worry about fitting, though they are hyper-focused on having true technical risk, but low business risk. And so they want to fund problems where the outcome is in doubt. They don't want to fund just what I call time and money problems, which is basically problems where it's just an engineering problem. If they give you enough dollars and enough smart engineers, you can solve the problem. But they also want low business risk. And what that means is that you actually have identified potential customers who actually want what you're trying to make. And the way they validate that is getting letters of support from those potential customers. NSF, their portfolio has the smallest companies. So 95% of their awardees have less than 10 employees. 87% have never won a phase two. 81% has been incorporated in the last 5 years. So phase one award is 275. Phase two is $1 million. And NSF has a nice phase 2B program, which essentially the way it works is if you raise $1 million during your phase two, they'll give you an extra $500,000. DOE. So DOE is another agency that has a lot of companies that win SBIRs over and over and over again. So there are 10 companies that have won 100 DOE SBIR awards alone, not even counting what they've won from other agencies, 24 with 50 to 100, and 192 between 11 and 100. The award sizes are generally around 250 in phase one, and then 1.1 or 1.6 million in phase two. The DOE is unique in the fact that it enables sequential phase twos. And so when you win a phase two, you can win a second and a third phase two off the same phase one. So if you do the math out, you can get close to $4 million off a single phase one if you go through the entire process. One interesting note about the DOE is where the reviewers come from. So by far, the largest makeup of reviewers are scientists out of the national labs. And it turns out that if you include a national lab as a partner on your DOE SBIR, you magically have a much higher success rate than if you don't. And the reviewer cohort explains why that happens. And then the last one I'm going to talk about is NIH. And I'm going to go pretty deep into this because it shows a lot of the interesting things about probability and how you can target programs. So NIH is not a monolithic agency as well. It's actually carved up into 26 different sub-institutes, all which have independent budgets, funding priorities, and rates of applications. And so what that translates to is even though the largest chunk of money is NCI, the cancer space, when you actually look at probabilities, this is from last year, it also turns out that NCI has one of the lowest probabilities. And so across those 26 institutes, there's dramatically different rates of success, ranging from, and last year, actually, one agency had a 0% success rate, and one had one that was over 50% for phase ones. And so, the other important thing to understand is these agencies have a lot of overlap, and that's just true across the federal government. The federal government is always inefficient. If one person's interested in funding it, that probably means there's 2 or 3 or 4 people interested in funding things. And so because of the overlap in missions, the goal of the company is to figure out which agency has the highest rate of success that might be interested in what you're doing, not just the one that's obvious. So like one of the things that we do is, we do a lot of cancer projects, but we try to find ways to get someone other than NCI to fund them because of we can get higher success rates elsewhere. Same with phase twos, wide divergence in success rates. And so, again, you're trying to find a situation where you have the highest possible success rate. Now, one of the problems is that the success rate data that's available is always backward looking. So the way it works is every roughly January or February, NIH will publish the success rate. But the problem is once that comes out, the next application deadline is in April. And so the January or February data tells you what happened in the prior year. But an April submission will actually come out of the following fiscal year. So there's a 2-year gap between the data that's available and the application you're submitting. And so what happens is that a lot of the past success does not guarantee future results. And so some of the higher performing agencies actually dip, and some of the low performing agencies actually improve substantially. And so you have to look at the data in a little bit smarter way to take full advantage of it. And so this is what the success data looks like. So basically, what it will do is actually give you the agency, number of proposals submitted, number of awards, success rate, and then how much money was spent in that particular mechanism. So in this case, we have phase 1 and phase 2 SBIRs from 2 agencies. One NIDCR, which is dental and craniofacial diseases. The other is NIEHS, which is environmental health sciences. On the surface, they both look like they're pretty equivalent. So NIDCR has a 30% success rate, so does NIHS. And if anything, you would say there's a slight advantage to going to NIDCR because it has a higher phase 2 success rate. However, when I look at these, I see something very different. And so what we focus on is the ratio of phase 1 awards to phase 2 proposals. And so the situation is that if I take a top example, they issued 17 phase 1 awards, but what I know now is that there'll be 17 companies competing for phase 2 awards versus in the prior year, there's only 7. So that large increase in large budget phase 2 awards is going to put tremendous pressure on their budget. Whereas in the bottom example, the number of phase 1 awards is actually similar to the number of phase proposals they had in the past. And so I expect there to be stability in their sort of proposal rate. So I think that the NIH rates will look very similar in the future, but I think that the NIDCR success rates are going to drop like a rock. And so I don't want to be trying to catch that knife. And so the issue is that there's little waves of success that form. And the issue is that if a sub-agency funds an abnormal number of phase 2s because they're multi-year projects, if they fund an abnormal number of phase 2s in a current year, that means next year they'll have an abnormal pre-existing funding because they basically made a commitment for both this year and next year when they fund a phase 2, which means the amount of free money available in that next year will be very low. But then conversely, the following year, those phase 2s will roll off the books, and you couldn't fund a lot of new projects last year, and so all of a sudden there'll be a lot of free money available. So little waves form, and you can catch them if you know how to find them. Okay, so I think if you take nothing away from that, it's that more goes into deciding where you go than just saying, oh, I have a cancer project, I should send this to NCI, or I have a battery, I should go to DOE. There's lots of differentiation in where you go, and trying to find the best place will maximize your success rate. Once you've picked where you're going, the next thing is scoping out a project that you want to do. And I think generally the biggest problem people run into is they don't really understand the game that they're playing. So if you work at a large company, whatever you're doing is a most efficient way to do that. But that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is the federal government saying, here's a small amount of money, prove to me that I should give you a large piece of money. And so it's really important that when you scope your project, you understand the inflection points. And those are the points where you add value. So for instance, and it's very rare that a company's value increases linearly. Instead, it's actually a stair function. So basically you do a certain amount of work, you do some testing, you get good results, you climb a stair. If not, you stay where you are. So if you build a prototype, if you don't actually test it, you're not actually improving the value because you don't actually know that it actually works. And so understanding what the points are that improve value and then building both your phase 1 and phase 2 around those inflection points will actually maximize the benefit both for you as a company, but also your chances of moving on into phase 2, and then using that to actually springboard into better things from there. So most agencies just have you do a phase 1, you compete for that, and then once you get to phase 1, you're now competing for a phase 2. However, some agencies offer 2 other alternatives. NIH makes the most use of these, but the DoD occasionally does as well. DOE does sometimes, and so our education does as well. Basically, there's 2 other options are a fast track and a direct to phase 2. So a phase 1 is the simplest thing. It's the simplest project. It requires the lowest level of preliminary data to be competitive. The next option is a fast track. So what a fast track is where you submit both the phase 1 and the phase 2 at the same time. And so the benefit here is that you're eliminating the gap between phase 1 and phase 2. So normally what happens is that you submit your phase 1, you do all the work. When it's all over, you submit a phase 2 proposal. There's generally then anywhere from 6 to 9 month lag between when that gets reviewed and funded. And so you have a big giant gap. Also, the other benefit is fast tracks. While the government has the right not to fund the second phase after you finish your phase 1, they have an extremely high conversion ratio, much higher than normal phase 1 to phase 2 ratios. However, they bring additional challenges. So reviewers will demand more preliminary data as part of a fast track because there is basically you're asking for a much larger chunk of money. In addition, because they know that the project's not going through a formal review process prior to phase 2, they really want to see clear quantitative phase 1 success criteria that gate moving forward to phase 1 to phase 2. But the biggest area where people get in trouble with fast tracks is what I call clarity of phase 2 objectives. So if you need your phase 1 results to properly design your phase 2 work, you're a terrible candidate for a fast track, because what ends up happening is you end up with a wishy-washy, we might do this, if that, if then type phase 2 proposal, and reviewers hate that. The third option is a direct to phase 2. And what you're saying there is you've already done the equivalent of a phase 1 already. I think it's important to understand what that really means. So first of all, you have to understand, one, how big is a phase 1 at that agency? So if I go to an EPA, for instance, where phase 1's $100,000, I'm saying I've done $100,000 of work on my own. If I go to NCI, where I can do a $400,000 phase 1, I'm saying that I've already done $400,000 worth of work. So you have to make sure the work you've done is equivalent to what a phase 1 would be at that agency. More importantly, for some agencies that are very competitive, even that won't be enough. So going back to the NCI example, because the oncology space is so competitive, even companies that have won phase 1 have a tremendous amount of data. And so what's really important is, are you on par with people who are winning a phase 2? Because you're going to be held to the standard of other phase 2 awardees. And so if you look at the other phase 2 award abstracts and what they're doing, and if you're kind of earlier than that, you're probably not a good candidate for a direct to phase 2. Generally, we're overall bullish on fast track and direct to phase 2 projects for a little while longer. That's due to federal budget issues. So, the federal government's been spending a lot of money since the beginning of the pandemic. It still is. I think the 2024 budget will remain intact based on being very similar to 2023. But beyond that, I think things are going to get problematic. I think, the government spent a lot of money. There has to be a pullback. We saw the same thing back, if you go back to 2008. So a lot of money was spent from 10, 11, 12, 13. And then in 2014, they had the sequester where they basically cut federal agencies across the board. We see that coming. And I would rather lock in large multi-year projects now than have to go back and compete for a phase 2 in the future where it might be much more competitive. Super important to avoid terminal phase 1s. And what that is, what I call it, is basically there are some projects which are not designed to produce the right kind of data to win a phase 2. And so those people, they lose the phase 2 the day they submit their phase 1, they just don't know it yet. And so when you think about how you scope on a phase 1, the real question is how do I win a phase 2? Not how do I do the most important things on my list of things to do for the company. And then finally, I just want to point out that there's often a disconnect between reviewers' reality and the commercial reality. So reviewers will hold you to this, what I call state of the science. versus state of the art. So state of the art is what's available in the market, but state of the science is what some reviewer read in a journal article. And so you have to basically understand those two different realities when you're sort of scoping out where your project is. Okay. Once you scope your project, next thing to do is to try to actually write a proposal. I think the first thing you need to understand is reviewers' perspectives. And so the way this works is reviewers will get, depending on the agency, anywhere between 4 and 10 proposals. Generally, a proposal can be anywhere from, the PDFs are usually anywhere from 60 to 200 pages long. So if I give you eight proposals with an average of 128 page long, that's a lot of work to review. Reviewers have to read all those, write comments, and then usually attend a 1 or 2 day meeting. And for their troubles, most agencies are paying them around $200 to $300. And so it's a lot of work for very little reward. It's more of like a community service item. And so reviewers don't actually have time to actually read all these proposals. And so what they're trying to do is figure out, what should I be reading and what should I not be reading? And so it's really important to understand what I call reviewers' points of entry, because you have to capture enough interest that they actually want to read your proposal fully versus just skim through it and write some comments and move on. And so this is no different than when you're in the airport and you go to the magazine stand, you pick up the magazine, you look at the cover, read the headlines, flip through the pages, look at the images, same thing here. So, most reviewers will actually flip through the proposal, look at the figures, they'll read the first page, look at the title and the abstract. If they're not interested at that point, they're probably just going to skim through it and write some comments. And then you'll read the comments and you'll be like, it's like they didn't even read it at all. And you're right, they didn't, but that's your own fault because you didn't actually make it interesting enough to make them want to actually read it. I generally tell people that most people are wrought to write the wrong way in this country. And there are 2 driving factors. So one is what I call writing to space. And so, you're in 3rd grade, you get your first writing assignment, it's read a book and write a report. And your first question is, how long does it have to be? And that how long does it have to be question will chase you your entire academic life. So you get rewarded for filling pages. So if you're in high school and they say write a 10-page term paper and you write 4 pages and then add 6 pages of fluff, and I write 8 pages of great content and stop, you'll get a better grade to me every time because you actually filled pages. And so what that does is it encourages incredibly inefficient writing styles. Now, despite the applications being long, in many cases, the actual science portion is quite short. So like typical NIH phase 1, you get 7 pages to describe the science. If you're using an inefficient writing style, you're leaving a lot of details out that reviewers want to know the answers to, and that will usually cause your project to fail. The second point is kind of an artifact of the 5-paragraph essay. So, people learn in school to have an introduction, build their details, come to some conclusion. I guarantee you that if you do that here, nobody's going to read your conclusion. And so the issue is you have to write more like the New York Times does, where if you read the headline in the first paragraph, you kind of know the story and you're building for details. So everything important has to be on the first page. In every section, everything important has to be in the first paragraph. In every paragraph, everything important has to be in the first sentence because you're in a constant battle to maintain reviewer retention. When you're trying to maintain interest, obviously, it's really important around having a focused narrative. I think a lot of people try to tell 100 different stories. They try to come up with every possible reason what they're doing is good. And it turns out that you're trying to tell 15 stories, you're guaranteed to tell none of them very well. And so it's really important that your narrative is focused and you understand like how you're navigating technology, how you're getting around problems, and have a clear understanding of the relative value of your multiple value propositions, and then put the most important ones in the most space. Second thing is outcome-driven objectives. So a lot of people just say things like, objective 1, I'm going to test my drug. But ultimately, and that's because a lot of people are sort of spin-off from the university world. So in the university world, you can sort of say, does process A produce effect B? And that's science. But here, it's does process A produce effect B at a minimum threshold C? And so the issue here is that threshold is set by what makes something commercially viable. And so you want all of your objectives to be driven by outcome-driven metrics that you can actually measure. And then finally, you need to have a very robust approach. So the level of detail required in the methodology of your approach is exactly what you would have to write a journal article for a scientific journal. It's just what I call a journal article that hasn't happened yet. Also important to potentially cite your peers, because God forbid one of the people in your space is a reviewer and you didn't cite their amazing work. Okay, so I think one of the advantages that we have is that we can look at grants in a different way. So what most people do is what I call the art of grant writing. So basically they write a grant, they get reviews, they then change their proposal based on those reviews, they resubmit, get new reviews from new reviewers with new problems, and rinse and repeat over and over again. So one of the nice things that we're able to do, because we have a large volume of clients, is actually sort of paralyze the whole thing and learn across the basis. And so, we have multiple projects reviewed by an individual panel. We can start to learn characteristics of how panels think, how program managers think, and how agencies think, and then use that to sort of shape projects. And so applying sort of a multi-level learning across our entire client base. When you write proposals, one thing that's important to understand is that really smart people, even the smartest of people, tend to be really bad with numbers. So this is actually a real study, and it's nothing to do with proposals, but I just love it because it sort of illustrates how bad people are with numbers, especially small numbers, smaller than 1. And so in this study, they took a bunch of psychiatrists and they said, hey, if you release this patient, 20 of 100 similar patients will commit a violent crime. And in that case, 41% of the psychiatrists said, I'm not releasing that patient. Then they gave a different patient and said, okay, if you release this patient, 20% of these similar patients will commit a violent crime. And in that case, only 21% refused to discharge the patient. So what's interesting, obviously, is 20 of 100 and 20% are the exact same number. And so the issue is that when you come to small numbers, the smaller they get, the harder people have conceptualizing them. And people understand them in different ways. So some people understand fractions, some people understand decimals, some people understand percentages. And so you often want to displace very small numbers multiple ways. Otherwise, people are going to misinterpret your numbers just because they're bad at numbers. People also tend to be really bad with their data figures. And so this is a real example based on a company that had an unfunded project came to us. And so this was a project meant to alleviate, basically, when you have a nerve severed, how you basically reconnect those things and repair the nerve damage. And so they submitted a proposal with a figure on the left. And what reviewers said is, your treatment's really no better than the control. But that was never the point. So on the resubmission, what we did was we annotated the data, because the point is that you would heal faster. Their value proposition was the reduction in recovery time. And so the reviewers left their own devices focused on the wrong axis, and therefore didn't see like it was a very valuable piece of technology, even though it was tremendously valuable. And the resubmission actually got funded. Okay. While all the agencies are supposed to theoretically care about commercialization, they do not all care about commercialization. Generally, commercialization comes much heavier into the phase 2 application than the phase 1 application. But there's a large spectrum in how people actually care. And it's driven by the agency's view, how they recruit viewers, and several other factors. So the classic example would be NSF. They care a lot about commercialization. And I would say that we tell our clients on a phase 2 NSF project, you play to win with the commercialization plan, you play not to lose with your research plan. And what that really means is you're going to spend 80% of your effort on the commercialization plan and 20% of your effort on the research plan. Now, if I go to NIH, it's the exact opposite. Where I tell people the exact opposite thing. It's 80% research plan, 20% commercialization plan, even though both agencies will tell you it's 50-50. And the issue is how the projects are reviewed. So NSF largest cohort reviewers tend to be prior SBIR awardees, aka people from startups. NIH's reviewers are largely dominated by academics. And so the academic scientist doesn't know what a good commercialization plan is. They know a lot of the wrong answers, but they don't know the right answer. And so they feel much more comfortable in the research plan. They spend most of their efforts there. And so understanding how the project is reviewed helps you understand how to spend your time and maximize, what you're doing. I tell everyone that if you don't win a phase 2, this whole thing is a waste of your time. Because if you're doing anything hard and interesting, a phase 1 is way closer to 0 than the kind of money that you need. And so everything's about winning phase 2s. That starts having a good phase 1 that's designed to change the narrative and produce interesting data that will support winning a phase 2 proposal. However, things don't always go according to plan. And so as soon as things are not going according to plan, I think there's two things to understand. So one, if your experiments aren't working the way you want to, you want to stop, pivot, see if there's anything you can do to actually change that. And then if you have to change your work, go back to the agency and say, hey, we want to do A instead of B. Generally, they're very supportive of changes that support the program. They don't want you to just blindly follow what you propose if it's no longer the right idea. And sometimes that happens just because, 9 months have elapsed between when you submit your proposal and when you're actually doing the work. Sometimes what you thought you were going to do isn't exactly what you're going to do, and you have to adjust those things. So you can talk with the agency to make adjustments to make sure it actually gives you the best chance to move forward. It's also important to understand the trade-off between submission time and success rate. So some agencies have a single phase 2 time period. So you start on, your project starts on a certain day, everyone submits their phase 2 at the same time. Other agencies give you options when you submit your phase 2. And that's where trade-offs come into play. So like at NSF, you can submit your phase 2 anywhere between 6 and 24 months after your phase 1 starts. At NIH, it's 2 years after the end of your phase 2. And it turns out there's an inverse relationship between how soon you go and what your success rate is. And so the issue is the longer you wait, the higher success rate that you have. Now, it's not because you're waiting, it's because normally you're making progress while you wait. And so, but at the same time, money that comes sooner to the company is worth way more than money that comes later on. And so what you're trying to figure out is, where do you get to that point of diminishing returns? So you can imagine that if I told you, all right, if you submit today, you have a 40% chance of winning your phase 2, but if you do the things you're planning on doing over the next 6 months, and then you submit, you have an 80% chance. Most companies are going to wait to get that probability. If I told them it was, 50 versus 52, most of them are going to go now because, 6 months is not worth 2% probability. And so what you're trying to do is understand like how you can maneuver your probability, but at what cost, and then decide if it makes sense or not for you. Okay. Generally, it's important to view proposals as an investment, not a binary event. So if you have a company that goes and pitches in a pitch event and they don't get funded, they don't crumble up their pitch deck, shut the company down. What they do is they learn from that, find somewhere else to pitch it, and move on. Same holds true here. So generally, when you submit a proposal, you're often going to be able to sort of resubmit it somewhere else or to the same agency and learn from what you've done in the past. Generally, I tell people, submit less proposals, but spend more time on each one, you'll win more awards. And then it's also important to note that, you can submit the same proposal to multiple agencies, but you have to be careful on how this works. So there are two strategies when you have a company that can submit to 2 agencies. One is where they sort of, what I call 2 shots on goal. They define a statement of work, let's say they send it to NSF, and then they take that, repackage it, and send it to NIH. But the work they're proposing to do is exactly the same. Now, what that does is increase their chances of getting funded, so they have 2 shots on goal. But if both agencies want to come back and fund that project, they have to turn one of them down, otherwise they get to go to prison. The other strategy would be to sort of take the work and divide it into 2 separate projects. But it also turns out it's not terribly hard to take one good project, chop it into half into 2 terrible projects. And so depending on the company and how well the work divides, that may or may not be a good strategy. Now, if you are able to divide the work, you now have the opportunity to accept awards from both agencies. Okay, so and now I just have a couple of thoughts on fundraising. So generally, when one of our clients wins a phase 1, the first thing I tell them is go raise some money. And about half of them will tell me, look at me and go, why? I just wanted a grant. I don't need to raise any money. So I think raising money during your phase 1 will help you win a phase 2 for a number of reasons. So one, a lot of reviewers like to see that because they know the government money is not enough. And so that shows that you're willing and able to raise money. I think 2, it allows you to potentially expand your phase 1 efforts if needed. So for instance, you can imagine like one of your experiments fails and you have to redo it. If you have your own money, you can afford to redo the experiment, you're going to put yourself in a better situation to win a phase 2. And then 3, it can cover the gap between phase 1 and phase 2 because you don't want to lose all your momentum when your phase 1 ends and you're waiting to hear back on your phase 2. And then I think finally, it's important to game plan out the other possibilities. So while everyone wants to win their phase two, these are incredibly competitive. And what happens if you don't? So when you win your phase one, you're in a position to raise money from a position of strength. And so if you think about it, you have your technology, your team, now you have some money, and you also have what I call third-party credibility. And that's really important in the current sort of climate, because what's happened over the last decade is, large VC firms, even mid-sized VC firms, have really moved away from early-stage investment. And then that gap's been filled by very small VC firms and angel investors. And those investors don't usually have the scientific credibility or understanding, sophistication to evaluate if your science is any good. So imagine I'm developing a drug for breast cancer. I meet an angel investor. He likes me, he likes my business plan. His aunt died of breast cancer, cares about this, but he has no idea if my molecule is any good or not. So he's not going to invest in me because he doesn't know if the scientific risk can be overcome. But if I tell him that I've won a peer-reviewed NCI SBIR phase one, he can kind of look over that and focus on the other aspects. And so it makes it easier for you to raise money. Now, if you game plan out the situation where you win a phase one, you don't raise money, and you don't win a phase two, what's your situation there? Well, the money's all gone. And in fact, now the sort of third-party credibility that you got from the award may actually be negative third-party credibility, because you have to explain to investors why NCI didn't want to fund your phase two. Their initial thought will be, well, must not have worked out that well. Science must not be any good. And so if you're raising money under those terms, it might be brutal. Same thing holds true in phase two. Obviously, it's just magnified because the amounts of money are much larger. And obviously a negative phase two is doesn't mean you didn't win the next award. What it means is your data didn't come out well. And at that situation, it's very, very desperate circumstances to get the money to actually sort of go back and loop back and redo some of the work. Okay, so you find an agency, you scope a project, you submit a proposal, you win an award. I like to say that your problems are just beginning. And so when you win an SBIR award, the government doesn't show up at your door with a big giant check and then just walk away. You are entering into a contractual obligation with the federal government. And while it's non-dilutive, it does come with a lot of strings. And so, and I want to cover some of the important things. So one, government data rights. So it turns out that anytime any IP is created under federal dollars, the federal government has the right to use that IP forever for free, which sounds terrible. However, it's not that bad. So one, I would say that the government has almost no history of actually using their rights. I think they're primarily there so that no one has to tell taxpayers the federal government spends $100 billion plus a year on R&D and gets nothing in return. More importantly, it's pretty easy to create a mitigation strategy. So imagine I want the federal government to fund all the R&D to create the first car. One of the things I'm going to do is pick some critical piece and make sure no federal dollar ever touches it. So imagine that I allow the federal government to pay for engines and transmissions and brakes and everything else that goes in a car, but I'm not going to let their dollars touch the wheel. And that way, even if they want to use their rights, they still have to go through me in the end, and therefore I protected the value of the work that I've done. And that way I've kind of insulated myself from that problem. Okay, secondly, accounting rules. So it turns out there's a giant stack of accounting rules that dictate how federal money can be spent, how it has to be accounted for, and how you have to record things. And they're really meant for the large universities and the Lockheeds and the Boeings of the world, but they apply to everybody. Generally, you have to keep a complete audit trail from every expenditure, source of expenditure, all the way through your books. Where SBIR companies tend to get in trouble, it's around the issue of labor. So in the federal government's eyes, the only way that you can document that labor time was spent on a grant is to keep timesheets. And those timesheets are required to keep kept on a daily basis. Now, startups hate timesheets because they're a big pain. And so if you're one of the tiny percentage of companies the government decides to audit you on this issue, it can go one of two ways if you don't have timesheets. There's a good way, which looks something like this. They come in, they see all your labor expense, and they go, great, show me your timesheets. And you go, well, I don't really have any. They're kind of a pain. We're a startup. We don't do that kind of stuff. They say, don't worry about it. We want our money back. That's the good version. The bad version looks exactly the same way, except when they're done asking for their money back, they tell you they're going to try to put you in prison. So keep timesheets. Next issue is cash flow issues. So depending on whether it's a grant or a contract, you may or may not have significant cash flow issues. So most grants tend to have good cash flow issues. So basically, they'll make the money available to you in an electronic account. You can easily access it within a day or so. If the agency issues their SBIRs as a contract, it's far more complicated. So contract agencies, Department of Defense, NASA, Homeland Security, they're issuing their funds as contracts. Because they're contracts, they have to buy something. What they end up buying is reports. And so what that actually does is, one, it increases your reporting requirements. And so every agency will have some kind of reporting, like annual or semi-annual. So like, for instance, NIH requires you 1 report a year, NSF 1 report every 6 months on the technical progress you're making. But because it's a contract and they want to pay you rapidly or frequently, they have to have them reports more frequently. So most DoD SBIRs have a monthly contract to them. So, and that creates also significant cash flow issues. So you work for a month, 15 days later, you submit your first report. 15 days after that, the program officer approves it. 30 days after that, you get paid. So that means about 90 days after $1 leaves your company, does $1 come back in. So you need a way to handle the cash flow issue. Now, it turns out it's not terribly difficult to get a line of credit based on a government contract, but you have to be prepared to deal with that issue. Okay. The next two things are kind of tied together. SBIR funding is super slow, and relying on this solely is a terrible idea. And just kind of give you like an absolute perfect scenario. So someone gets motivated based on today, decides to put a proposal in, take about 3 months to put together a good proposal, they submit it, they wait 6 months to get an award, they then win that award, they then meet all their milestones, get done on time, don't require no cost extension, then spend 3 months putting together a phase 2 proposal, submit that, wait again, and then they win their phase 2, which is a 2-year project. This is a 3.5 to 4-year process where the vast bulk of the money comes at the tail end, second half of the time frame. And so what that means is things move very slowly and not as fast as you want them to do. And I think that one of the big mistakes small companies make is they think they're being smart about equity, but they're really not considering the size of the pie that's actually being created. So most products have a 5 to 7 year life cycle of peak revenue. And the biggest mistake you can make is if you waste a lot of time early on, you're shrinking that window. So instead of 5 to 7, it might turn out to be 3 or 4 or 2 to 3. And so if you actually do that and let's say you say 15% equity by not raising money, but you actually delay your product by 3 to 4 years, you might say, wow, I have 15% more equity, but you also might own 15% more of a pie that's 4 or 5 times smaller than it otherwise would be. And so it's really important to understand how this fits in to make sure you have the right sort of timing process. And okay, and with that, we'll go on to questions. And I see that there's a bunch of things in the chat, and so maybe I'll try to see if any of these I need to answer. Oh, okay, here we have one from John Abbey. Submitted directive phase 2 to the Air Force. Well, okay, this is a good question. So John had a DoD phase 2, which received the notification, which it's selectable, but not funded. And what that means is they felt it was good enough to fund, but there was not enough dollars lying around. Now, what that means is a couple of things. One, that Air Force could come back at any time and decide to fund that whenever they want. And that does happen sometimes where they realize they have more money or something they thought they were going to fund is not going to be funded. And therefore they can run it. It also gives you carte blanche to find somebody else with money who's willing to fund it. And so, though this is not necessarily easy to do, frankly, if you had a stakeholder in the Army or another part of the Air Force who was interested in your technology, said, well, I'd love to give you funding, and you told him, wow, I have a selectable contract, it would make it really easy for him to fund you. He wouldn't have to issue an RFA, a topic, or anything. He could just go and fund you based on that opportunity. And now, depending upon which cross-agency you're talking about, sometimes that's easier or harder because some agencies play well together and some don't. As far as that strategy there, I think what you're trying to do is find other people with similar interests, probably in the Department of Defense, and to actually see if you can get someone else interested in it. As far as including the termination letter in future direct to phase twos, I don't know that's a great idea. I think some people will view that as unrelated. You might mention that if you were submitting the same exact project, you might mention this was previously submitted and found to be selectable. But I think some reviewers kind of feel like, we don't need you to tell us whether it's going to be selectable or not. We'll figure that out ourselves. So like, don't put the thumb on the scale. So I have kind of mixed feelings on that issue. So Dustin's a researcher at UNLV, has a novel library of compounds. Question was, am I only eligible for NIH STTR? I think the one other possibility is there, depending on what the compounds are good for, you could also be eligible for DoD type funding. There was a small heartbeat where NSF was interested in pharma. So when the pandemic started, they started to fund some pharmaceutical companies. They had not done that prior. They have a pharmaceutical technologies topic out right now, but it's going to go away. And so what they really want to be funding at NSF would be like drug delivery. They don't want to go after individual compound/indication possibilities. And so Dustin, yes, NIH STTR is going to be your best, most interesting place to be. Okay, Matthew asked about company services. So basically, the way our company works is there's a whole broad range of levels of services that range anywhere from a coaching process where we coach you the process to one where my team will actually write a proposal for you. Our business model is like a project fee plus incentive fee structure. Behind the scenes, the way we work, we generate about 30% of our revenue from project fees and the rest come from incentive fees. And about half our revenue comes from phase two incentive fees. So basically the idea being I wanted to create a model where we win together or we lose together. And I think, in the space of helping with SBIRs, there's a lot of bad business models that encourage problematic things. So like, let's imagine you're paying someone like me on an hourly basis. You have sort of a bunch of misaligned incentives. So, I get incentivized to be inefficient, which is stupid. You get incentivized to use as little of my time as possible, which is counterproductive. And most importantly, it'll destroy what I call the honest broker relationship. And so the issue being, let's say one of you comes to me with like, oh, here's this Navy topic that I want to go after. I might know that Navy program manager has funded the same two companies every year for the last decade. You need me to tell you that. And so it's important you have good business models. If you want to chat more about that, there's a little link to my calendar. I'm happy to get on the phone and talk about how it would work with your particular company. Okay, so Dustin just followed up brain. So I think one of the interesting things, depending on what brain is an interesting place to be because it opens up multiple avenues at NIH. So obviously you have NINDS, depending on the conditions you're going after, NIMH, which is National Institute of Mental Health. NINDS is National Institute of Neurological Strokes and Disorders, Neurological Disorders and Stroke. You also have NIA. Congress has been allocating, if it's useful for Alzheimer's, Congress has been allocating obscene amounts of money for Alzheimer's. There's no easier project to get funded right now at NIH than an Alzheimer's project. Also, you might consider NCATS, which is the National Center for Advanced Translational Sciences. They like to look at compounds that have efficacy in multiple indications that span different institutes. That could be a possibility as well. So there's a lot of possibilities within NIH you might consider. Okay, so somebody asked about, I think Allison asked about the IP. So her question is, I thought IP was not able to be funded. So, and let me distinguish two things. There are two parts of generating IP. One is the work that creates the data and the invention process, and one is the patenting process. So you cannot fund the patenting process with SBIR money, or at least not your direct and indirect costs. You can only fund the technical work on it. However, you can use the profit money. So when you do an SBIR, you're allowed to make a profit. Usually it's about 7% of total costs. You can use that money towards filing for patent protection. So you can use that money, but yeah, the grant's not going to pay for your patent costs as a direct cost, but it will pay for the technical work that creates the idea. Okay, so Lauren, great question. Should a startup push for more detailed feedback after a project is rejected? There is a huge variety in how much feedback you get from a review panel, depending on the agency. The best two would be NSF and NIH, that you get very, very detailed feedback. It's super informative. The worst case is the Department of Defense. Sometimes you get like a couple sentences. The DOE is not much better. Generally, I think you're not going to get much more feedback from the panel. You might get the program officer to talk with you on the phone. One important thing to understand for the DOE is that the program managers have a lot of latitude in picking based on the way the review process works. And so there's no downside to going back to the program manager and talking about your project and seeing how they felt about it and learning more about it. I'd also say, though, in some cases, there's no upside. You don't hear anything different than you already got in the writings, or in some cases, they won't even respond to your emails. But definitely worth a try and see what you get from there. Finley asked about SBIR, STTR. Okay, this is a great question. There's a number of different layers here. So one, SBIR, STTR, obviously, one part of this is how well do you fit in the structure? So, one advantage of let's say, an STTR or an SBIR is that if I wanted to give more money to a university, I have greater latitude to do that. So I can do 40% of the work in-house and do 60% at the university. So if I lack the right facilities, STTR can be advantageous. But more importantly, I think there's differences in success rates between SBIRs and STTRs, and they depend upon where and when you're going. So like if I'm doing an NSF phase 1 SBIR right now, I'd rather do it as an STTR because I'm going to get a pretty significant probability advantage. If I'm doing an NSF phase 2, I'd rather do it as an SBIR, and you can switch between phases. If I go to NIH, it depends upon each individual institute. And so sometimes there are very substantial probability advantages over one or the other. And so if I could fit my project into either, then I want to choose whichever one has the most sort of viability. Some agencies, like for instance, the Department of Energy, allow you to apply for both at the same time, which is a very interesting strategy. However, you have to create a program that actually fits the requirements of both programs. And so the way that would work is, so the SBIR says you can subcontract no more than 1/3 of the work. The STTR program says you have to give at least 30% to the university. So you have to create a project where the university's budget falls between 30 and 33% of the budget. If you do that, you can check the box which says I'm applying for an SBIR or an STTR, which gives you access to both buckets of money. And so that allows you to be, the agency can put you wherever they have more money and maximizes your success rate. Obviously, when you work with academic health systems, generally all academics, the way STTRs and actually even an SBIR would work, when you work with a university, the way the IP terms will go something like this. If they create the new IP under the money, they'll own it. If you create it, you'll own it. If you do it together, you'll jointly own it. Though usually in the terms of the agreement, you get preferential rights to license it if they create something new. However, generally, virtually all STTRs we do fall into one of two cases. Either one, the technology was originally created by that university, and so therefore there's no new IP, or if there is IP, it's just adding on to an existing license that's being gotten by the small business. Or we're using the university because they have unique evaluation skills. And so I go to them and I'm like, okay, here's my Alzheimer's drug. You have an Alzheimer's mouse model. Please evaluate it for me. The IP is in the molecule that I've created, not in them running the experiments. And so they're just doing something useful to actually compare the data. So, and then last question, Finley asked, how does your company differ from Turbo SBI, Grantify, and other technology-assisted companies? So I'll put it this way. If you go to Turbo SBIR's website, you can look at their webpage and you'll see that they, have submitted, they say they've submitted 3,500 proposals and they have $20 million in funding. We have $80 million in funding this year alone. If you think about the math out, if you submitted 3,500 proposals, you should have hundreds of millions of dollars in funding, and they have $20 million in funding. The notion that you can, I don't know if anyone's tried to use like ChatGPT, what that kind of stuff gets you is basically what I call middle 50% mediocre stuff. You can't do this kind of detailed work. Whoever you're using, you should be working with scientists who actually understand science to actually put a proposal together. If not, whoever you're using is probably a bad candidate. And so, one thing that could have created a lot over the last couple of years is a lot of companies coming into this space, making a lot of claims that are pretty clearly not true. So one thing that we do, if you go to our LinkedIn page, you'll see that every time one of our clients wins, we post the award, we link to the client. And so we have a long history of verifiable wins. I think if you challenge Term SBIR, Grantify to do the same thing, you'd find their list is very, very small. Okay, so Finley also asked about AI models can be used for FDA device certification. So I'm not quite sure I understand the question. I'm assuming if you develop the FDA model, if you develop an AI model, could you actually use that as a product that would become, FDA regulated? Absolutely. But there's a whole separate, regulation issue which has to do with, software, which is a regulatory question, not an SBIR question.
Okay, Kirk, thank you so much for your time and in your invaluable insights. We have pasted your contact information in the chat, and we will share it with the folks here in the room. So thank you so much for the presentation.